Hey everybody, today I want to talk about the three presidents of the Progressive Era, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. So if you'd like to follow along, this slideshow is just called Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. So these are the three presidents during the Progressive Era. Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft are both Republicans, and Woodrow Wilson will be a Democrat. Okay, so Teddy Roosevelt, he's a very interesting person. I've got a great documentary you can watch if you'd like to. I'll post that kind of on slide two under his name. But Teddy Roosevelt's born in the 1850s, right before the Civil War. He's a very weak and sickly child. He grows up, goes to Harvard, gets involved in politics. He gets married. He has kind of a tragic early life. His mother and his wife die on the same day. So he has kind of a terrible early life that causes him to basically pack his bags and move out west. He goes out to the Badlands to become a cowboy, spend some time out there kind of figuring out what he wants to do with his life. He comes back to New York, remarries, he climbs the political ladder. So he becomes police commissioner, he becomes an assemblyman in the New York State Assembly, he becomes Assistant Secretary of the Navy, then he fights in the Spanish American War, and later on he's going to become governor and then President of the United States. Um, Basically, when he becomes governor, he works within the Republican Party, and he works with this guy named Senator Platt, and they basically make a deal. Senator Platt helps him become governor as long as he doesn't do too much reforming. We want an old-fashioned conservative politician who kind of leaves things alone. Once Teddy Roosevelt becomes governor, he turns out to be a reformer, though. He challenges the corrupt leaders in his party, kind of the good old boy system. He supports regulation. He supports preserving forests. He works with labor. A lot of previous politicians would kind of look at labor as radical and take the side of management, but Teddy Roosevelt does the opposite of that. Remember how I said William McKinley's vice president dies in 1899, and that was important? The reason that is important is because Teddy Roosevelt becomes McKinley's new vice president. And basically, the reason they did this, excuse me, being vice president was considered a dead end job. Today, a lot of times the vice president is who is going to run for the presidency the next time. That's not how it used to be. The vice presidency used to be kind of a pointless job. You're basically there in case the president dies. So the Republican Party leaders made Teddy Roosevelt vice president because they wanted to kill his career. They didn't like that he was a progressive reformer of New York, so they said, "How do we get rid of him? Let's make him the second highest position, second highest man in the land, and that'll kill his career." What ends up happening is William McKinley gets assassinated just after the start of his second term by Leon Czolgosz. He was a anarchist, and Teddy Roosevelt becomes president. Mark Hanna, who was kind of the political brains behind William McKinley, he supposedly said, "Now look, that damn cowboy is president of the United States." So they tried to kill his career. They ended up making him president of the United States. Now, one of the first things Teddy Roosevelt does is he sits down and has a dinner at the White House with Booker T. Washington. Um, Remember, Republicans support civil rights for blacks. So Teddy Roosevelt sits down with Booker T. Washington, and also the way the Republican Party worked. Teddy Roosevelt knew a lot of the Republicans didn't like him because he was too much of a reformer. Um, he wanted the support of Booker T. Washington because Booker T. Washington could kind of control a lot of the Southern delegates to the Republican Party, and a lot of the Southern delegates to the Republican Party are black. So Teddy Roosevelt is also kind of maneuvering for the election of 1904. If I can get the black vote, then I'll have a chance at getting the nomination. A lot of people think Teddy Roosevelt is just going to serve out William McKinley's term and then the Republicans won't pick him in 1904 to run for president. So Teddy Roosevelt's also being smart politically, but he's also doing this because he supports civil rights for blacks. This is seen as a big step kind of in race relations. The Democrats throughout the nation are enraged. Senator Benjamin Tillman of South Carolina said we shall have to kill 1,000 Negroes to get them back in their place, except he didn't use the word Negroes. He used the N word. Bishop Henry Turner, who was kind of a famous Christian bishop, he said to Teddy Roosevelt, "You are about to be the greatest representative and hero of the Negro race, notwithstanding you have been very conservative." So Teddy Roosevelt is trying to get black support, but also show support for civil rights. Teddy Roosevelt starts busting up monopolies and trusts. The Elkins Act gets passed in 1903. It says the government can fine railroads for offering rebates, basically manipulating their prices. The Hepburn Act sets maximum rates for railroads. Remember some of those things the populists wanted, regulation of railroads. Here you see Teddy Roosevelt getting that done. There's a real famous coal strike in 1902. The workers threatened to go on strike, and this is a big deal. Schools in the country, businesses, they heat homes, they heat their places with coal. So if you don't have coal for the nation, it's like not having gasoline today. If all the gasoline industry went on strike and we didn't have gasoline, our civilization would grind to a halt. That's basically what they do with coal back then. The workers, they threaten to go on strike. They want higher wages, shorter hours, more safety. They want their union recognized. Teddy Roosevelt, calls together the strike leaders and the mine owners. He tries to work out a compromise. He tells both sides to give in a little. Nothing happens. So Teddy Roosevelt actually sees the mine owners as the real obstacle to getting a compromise accomplished. The workers are willing to compromise a little bit, but the mine owners aren't. So Teddy Roosevelt threatens to bring in the military and keep the mines open. He says the Constitution was made for the people, not the people for the Constitution. So here's one of those instances of saying it doesn't really matter what the Constitution says. We've got to think more about what's good for society. Eventually, the mine owners cave. They give their workers better pay and more safety, although they don't recognize their union. Teddy Roosevelt's kind of approach to reform, his policies for America, they get called the Square Deal. They focus on protecting the consumer or the public and regulating corporations. And you can kind of see a lot of political cartoons of the era show Teddy Roosevelt as kind of squeezing the rich guy or standing up to the rich guy. Now, Teddy Roosevelt does pretty good his first 3 years as president, and he runs for election in 1904. This is his first election as president. He wins overwhelmingly. You can see he wins all of the North, all of the West. The only place he doesn't win is the Solid South, and that's because he was, as a Republican, he was good on civil rights, and the Solid South does not support civil rights. They support segregation, so they're opposed to Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt makes a promise never to run again. Traditionally in America, you're only supposed to be president for 2 terms. When George Washington was president, he stepped down after 2 terms, and he said that's all one man should do. So every president follows that tradition. They're only president for 2 terms. Teddy Roosevelt's second term has more issues. There's a panic in 1907. He tries to implement a lot of reforms. You can kind of see there on slide 28. All of these reforms are defeated in Congress, so he doesn't accomplish as much as he would like to. And when it's time to retire, he passes the torch on to his Secretary of War, William Howard Taft. Teddy Roosevelt sees Taft as the most able-minded person in his administration to become president. And Roosevelt's pretty popular, so Roosevelt's endorsement carries a lot of weight. Remember Secretary of War William Howard Taft, he'd been governor in the Philippines earlier on. He runs against William Jennings Bryan. Remember, William Jennings Bryan is the young congressman from Nebraska. He ran in 1896, 1900, and now again in 1908. He's defeated again, so he just can't be president no matter what he tries. While this is going on, Teddy Roosevelt's off in Africa killing big game. William Howard Taft becomes president. He's seen as really good friends with Teddy Roosevelt, but he's not as much of a reformer. William Howard Taft has a very good legal mind, but he's not as progressive as Roosevelt. Basically, here's what Taft does. or let me explain what Roosevelt did. Roosevelt would look at a big corporation or a monopoly and he would say, is this big corporation good or bad for society? If it was good, he left it alone. If it was bad, he busted it. So Teddy Roosevelt would distinguish between good and bad trusts or monopolies. Okay? William Howard Taft says that's not what you're supposed to do. You have to look at the law, and if the law forbids something, you have to enforce that, whether or not it's good or not. So he's more of a follow the strict letter of the law. So when William Howard Taft looks at a big corporation, he doesn't say, is it good or bad for society? He says, does the law require me to break it up? And if the law does, then I have to break it up. So that's how he's different. And William Howard Taft actually breaks up more monopolies and trusts than Teddy Roosevelt does because he doesn't distinguish between good and bad corporations. Eventually, William Howard Taft and Teddy Roosevelt become enemies. There's something called the Pinchot-Bollinger affair. Basically, Pinchot was a friend of Teddy Roosevelt, and he has an argument with one of William Howard Taft's men, Secretary of the Interior Bollinger. They have a dispute over Alaska. Taft fires Pinchot, which was Teddy Roosevelt's friend. So Teddy Roosevelt's off in Africa, and he hears all these reports about how William Howard Taft is not doing the progressive things he thought he would. Later on, Taft attacks the purchase of the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company by United States Steel Corporation. This is one of those times where William Howard Taft looked at this and said, the law forbids this because it would make it too big. Well, Teddy Roosevelt had looked at this before he left the presidency, and he had said, this is okay because it'll be good for America. Forget if it's legal or illegal, it will be good. So he allowed it to happen, and William Howard Taft said that's not how the law works. You don't get to determine if it's good or bad, you just determine whether it's the law or not. So basically, William Howard Taft, from Teddy Roosevelt's point of view, is not doing a good job. So what ends up happening is they have a falling out. They had been really good friends, but then they become bitter enemies. Right before kind of the ends of their lives, they do become friends again. And we get to one of the biggest and most important elections in American history, the election of 1912. If you want to read a book, there's a great book on that slide, slide 41, just about the election. But this is a four-way race. Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson, and Eugene Debs, the socialist. Okay, I want to introduce Woodrow Wilson because he's going to be really important during World War I. Woodrow Wilson was born in Virginia right before the Civil War. He remembers the Civil War. As a young boy, he saw Jefferson Davis as a prisoner being taken captive in chains to the north. The prison train came through the town Woodrow Wilson was in. Wilson was a very pro-Southern person. He's a Democrat. He is against civil rights for blacks. He's pro-segregation. He always thinks the South is superior to the North. But he does remember what war is like. And you got to remember, the South is the only part of America that's totally been devastated by war. Nobody else has actually seen total war before in America besides the South, because the Civil War was so brutal in the South. So Woodrow Wilson remembers that. When he went to college at Princeton later on, he would argue with his roommates about how the South was better than the North. And classmates would talk about how he would get really worked up about the Civil War, about civil rights, about the superiority of the South. Wilson grew up struggling to read. He probably had dyslexia, but his father taught him to memorize speeches, to write shorthand. He's a very smart person. He might be one of the most intellectual presidents we've ever had. I think Wilson, maybe Jefferson, Richard Nixon, those are some of the ones off the top of my mind that are considered the most intellectual presidents. Wilson, like I said, goes to Princeton. He falls in love with a woman named Ellen Axon. Wilson is a very passionate man. He writes a lot of poetry to the women he falls in love with. But nobody really knows that Wilson is a passionate person. He's a very cold person on the outside. Think of an intellectual giant who's very socially awkward, hard to talk to, kind of cold and distant. That's how Woodrow Wilson was a lot of times, but privately, he's a very passionate person. A reporter once said shaking that man's hand was like shaking a dead fish. Um, Wilson writes his doctoral thesis. It's called Congressional Government, A Study in American Politics. And basically, he argues the federal government is too weak. We need to make the government more powerful. Um, he said the president should take a bigger role, not just Congress. So remember how I said, the American founders, they said Congress should be the leading branch of government. Government is supposed to be limited. We divide power out between the federal government and the states. Wilson kind of says, the way the American founders did it worked great in their time, but we don't live in that time anymore. So Wilson kind of had a negative view of a lot of the founders. In his writings, he kind of criticizes a lot of the things they did in creating the nation. He becomes president of Princeton in the early 1900s, um, and he starts to kind of give speeches about progressivism and how industrialization needs to be kind of tamed and made gentler on society. If you look at slide 52, you can see that's the house he lived at Princeton. While he's there, his father dies. His wife's brother's wife and son die in a drowning accident. Wilson loses sight in one of his eyes. Doctors tell him he has to quit teaching. He has to quit being president of the college. Otherwise, he'll kill himself just because of overworking himself. So he kind of has this point in his life where he has a very hard kind of thing to deal with. He decides to go on vacation to Great Britain and Bermuda. He meets a woman in Bermuda named Mary Peck, probably has an affair with her. His wife, Ellen, discovers some of their love letters later on. Um, Wilson comes back to America. He's picked by the Democrats to run for governor of New Jersey. He gets elected in 1910, and basically, kind of like Teddy Roosevelt, they didn't expect they would get a reformer. They kind of expected a conservative, good old fashioned person, uh, good old boy, go along to get along, but they actually got a reformer. Wilson put out a number of progressive reforms as governor of New Jersey. Anti-corruption laws, election reform, regulating corporations, workman's comp. He pulls out the Constitution of New Jersey and kind of says, "This gives me the authority to enact these reforms." Um, a lot of newspapers, a lot of party leaders throughout the country start mentioning Wilson as a candidate for president in 1914. Or sorry, 1912, not 1914, 1912, and he gets the nomination. It's a really contested convention on the 46th ballot. He gets nominated as the Democratic candidate. Williams Jennings Bryan put his support behind Wilson. Bryan, the three-time failed presidential candidate, can't win the presidency, but he can throw his weight around to help nominate the next person. He does. So the election of 1812 is a four-way race. Teddy Roosevelt's platform is called New Nationalism. He forms a third party called the Progressive or the Bull Moose Party. He gave a speech where he said, "I feel as strong as a bull moose," and so his party kind of got nicknamed that. He wants to keep reforming. Uh, Woodrow Wilson feared Teddy Roosevelt because Teddy Roosevelt is exciting. He's manly. He loves to talk in public. He'll slap you on the back, tell a good joke. Everybody loves Teddy Roosevelt. Even people that hate him kind of love him. Woodrow Wilson's nothing like that, so he's kind of worried. Poor old Taft basically realized nobody liked him. He kind of didn't really know why he was running. Woodrow Wilson's platform is called the New Freedom, and uh, Roosevelt's New Nationalism and Wilson's New Freedom are kind of similar. They both want progressive reforms. Both of them are progressive, so you really have two progressives running for president. Um, so I'll kind of let you read some of their thoughts. I put a lot of quotes in there from speeches so you could kind of get a feel for what they thought during the campaign. So you can kind of read that. Eugene Debs also runs. He calls for socialism in America. Um, Wilson has a lot of instances where he has to deal with civil rights and kind of segregation. The New York Age was a black newspaper, and it said, "It is not possible for a single self respecting Negro in the United States to vote for Woodrow Wilson." Woodrow Wilson's very pro Southern, pro Democratic, pro white supremacy. Um, Wilson does talk to the black community, and he says that he will support civil rights. He will veto legislation that hurts the black community. Um, this meeting gets published in the magazine Crisis, and Wilson gets mad because he doesn't want the public to know that he had a secret meeting with a black leader. Compare this: Teddy Roosevelt invited Booker T. Washington to the White House. People knew about it. Um, he's an open supporter of civil rights. Wilson meets privately with black leaders, but then gets mad when that gets made public, and he denies that he did that. Um, During the campaign, Teddy Roosevelt's giving a speech in Milwaukee, and somebody tries to shoot him. Uh, if you look at slide 89, you can see the speech, and Teddy Roosevelt's shirt stops the bullet, and he ends up going and giving his talk anyways. So Teddy Roosevelt's a pretty tough cookie. Now, if you look at slide 92, you can see that it looks like Woodrow Wilson crushes it. He wins a majority of the states. He wins almost all the states. But what ended up happening is Taft and Roosevelt split the Republican vote. There are basically two Republicans running in this race and one Democrat, so the Republicans split their vote. If you added Roosevelt and Taft's votes up, they would have crushed Wilson. Wilson only gets 43% of the vote. When Wilson runs for re-election in 1916, he gets, I think, 48 or 49%. So Wilson's president twice, but he never gets a majority of Americans to vote for him. So Wilson becomes president. He attacks what he calls the triple wall of privilege: the tariffs, the banks, the trusts. Passes something called the Underwood Tariff that lowers tariffs. The income tax gets passed. That's the 16th Amendment. That's really important to remember. The 16th Amendment is the creation of the income tax. The Federal Reserve Act gets passed. It creates a Federal Reserve Board that supervises national banks. So if you look at slide 96, you can kind of see there's different areas where the 12 banks kind of oversee all the other banks in their area. He makes the antitrust laws stronger. He establishes the Federal Trade Commission. Wilson doesn't trust labor necessarily. He sometimes thinks they're too radical, but as he's president, he starts to take their side more and more. There's a couple instances of some labor violence. A union worker, John McNamara, blows up the headquarters of the Los Angeles Times in 1910. There's a famous act of violence called the Ludlow Massacre in Colorado. There's strikes at the Colorado mines. The National Guard comes in. Fighting breaks out. The strikers' camp gets set on fire. A number of people die. There's rioting. Basically, Wilson starts to take the side of labor. He feels like they're getting the short end of the stick. Racially, as a president, Wilson takes America backwards. When he was president of Princeton, he had kept blacks out of the college. Wilson brings segregation to the federal government, so he wants segregation reintroduced in Washington, D.C. James Monroe Trotter famously said to him, "Have you a new freedom for white Americans and a new slavery for your Afro-American fellow citizens?" He has a meeting with Wilson in 1914 and kind of clashes with him. One of the things Wilson does is he shows the movie The Birth of a Nation in the White House. Now, this movie was basically a movie that portrayed the Ku Klux Klan as the saviors of the South. Basically, the movie's premise is during the Civil War and after, Republicans and blacks did terrible things to the South. Republicans and blacks are corrupt, they're vicious people, and they just wreaked havoc on the South. And who saved the South? The Ku Klux Klan comes in and saves the South. Wilson showed this movie in the White House, and said something about it's history written like lightning or with lightning. So he basically says it's true. This is the correct view of the Civil War and Reconstruction. You know, blacks and Republicans are terrible, and the Ku Klux Klan is great. Wilson has to deal with people protesting against women not being able to vote. I kind of talked about that earlier. So Wilson wants to focus on domestic affairs, and he basically says it would be terrible if I had to focus on foreign affairs. But as we'll see in our next lecture, that's exactly what happens. World War I comes along, and that's pretty much all Wilson gets remembered for is what he did in World War I.